Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 12 lecture on land use planning. So we're going to talk about the need for planning, historical forces that have shaped land use, factors that contribute to urban sprawl, problems associated with unplanned urban growth. So first off, the need for planning. Human development impacts upon all facets of the environment. And while most apparent in urbanized areas, there's literally no place left on the globe that doesn't bear some evidence of the impact of humankind. Most land use decisions are still based primarily on economic considerations or short-term needs rather than on unique analysis of the landscape. And once land has been converted to intensive human use, it's generally unavailable for other uses. Some historical forces that have shaped land use. Present land use in the United States is more than half for crops and livestock. Well, not goats, but I do love goats. 44% forests and natural areas, and 4% for intensive human use. This pattern of land use differs greatly from original conditions experienced by immigrants from the New World. So the first U.S. colonists, European colonists, would have converted the landscape to farming and then to towns and cities, which is sort of what we see here, right? Predominantly crops and livestock and a small amount for intensive human use. Waterways are also important for development and planning. They were the primary method of transportation in early European settlement of North America, and this allowed for exploration and development of commerce. Early towns were usually built near water and at transfer points between water systems, and the waterfront became a center of intense industrial activity. And as industrial activity increased in the cities, people began to move from rural to urban centers for the job opportunities that these centers provided. So the rural to urban shift, North America remained essentially rural until industrial growth began in the last third of the 1800s. Cities grew because of the Industrial Revolution. People migrated from farms to industrial jobs found in the cities. And European immigrants congregated in the cities where jobs were available. There were also more cultural, social, and artistic opportunities available in the cities. Migration from the central city to the suburbs. So in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, a lack of control over industry activities led to polluted and undesirable waterways. And as roads and rail transport became more common, many left the waterway areas. Agricultural land surrounding the towns was converted into housing, and land began to be viewed as a commodity, not as a non-renewable resource to be managed. So take a moment, pause this video, and write down your thoughts in your student version of the PowerPoint slides. How do you think modern Americans view land? Do we see it today as a commodity, a non-renewable resource, or something else? What do you think? Characteristics of the suburbs. As cities grew, certain sections within each city began to deteriorate, and pollution and crowding made cities undesirable places to live. In the early 1900s, people who could afford to move out of the cities began to do so. So in 1950, 60% of urban population lived in the center of cities. But by 1990, only 30% of urban populations lived in central cities. How does this relate to environmental justice? If it's undesirable because of pollution and overcrowding to live in the central city, who is going to be left in the 30% that can't afford to move out to the suburbs? Oops. Pause this video. Write down your thoughts. How does this relate to environmental justice? Excuse me. All right, characteristics of suburbs. Urban sprawl is the pattern of unplanned, low-density housing and commercial development outside of cities. Land use practices are fundamental to sustainability, and two practices that have contributed to urban sprawl are zoning ordinances that isolate employment and shopping services away from housing locations, and low-density planning aimed at creating automobile access to increasing expanses of land. Can you live effectively in the suburbs without a car? But compare that to living in a central city. Can you get to everything you need in the central city without having your own car? Patterns of urban sprawl. Sprawl is characterized by excessive land consumption, low densities and compared with older centers, a lack of choice in ways to travel, fragmented open space, wide gaps in development, and a scattered appearance, a lack of choice in housing types and prices, separation of uses into distinct areas, repetitive one-story development, commercial buildings surrounded by large parking areas, and a lack of public spaces and community centers. Some patterns we see, or three major patterns that we see, are the development of exclusive, wealthy suburbs adjacent to the city. Tract development is the construction of similar residential units over large areas. So this would be like where you see neighborhoods where it's like the same house repeated 100 times but with a different color front door or something. And ribbon sprawl consists of commercial and industrial buildings lining highways, connecting housing developments to the central city. A megalopolis is a merging of cities into large urban areas. So here's a picture of the different types of development. Wealthy suburbs, tract development, and leapfrog development. Regional cities in the US and Canada. So you can see the bright spots on the map. This would be like a picture taken at night where you can see city lights. So you can see the more white there is, the more heavily impacted that area is for human use. Some factors that contribute to sprawl are lifestyle. Increased wealth of the population is reflected in material possessions, particularly automobiles and homes. And a decentralized housing pattern is possible because of a high rate of car ownership, and that allows for ease of movement. Economic factors are also important. So building on agricultural land is less expensive than to build within established cities, right? If you're going to build a new house in what was formerly a cornfield, the land's already flat, there's no trees on it, and it's probably right up to a road, so you have easy access to it. Whereas if you're going to rebuild or build in a city, you'll have to pay to demolish something that's already there and clean it up and remove it before you have an empty space where you can build a new building. Our current tax laws also encourage home ownership. Some planning and policy factors. Historically, there was little coordination of effort as to how cities should develop. Large cities have a huge number of political jurisdictions, so coordination is often very difficult. And zoning ordinances prohibit land use mixing. Ordinances specify the minimum lot and house sizes. Government subsidizes the development of decentralized cities. Local governments pay some costs of extending services into new areas, and those costs are not passed on to the builders. Problems associated with unplanned growth. Transportation is the big one. So as cities grew, little thought was given to transportation corridors. An establishment of new corridors stimulates growth in nearby areas, and the new corridors soon become inadequate. So reliance on cars has required a constant road building. And in Los Angeles, 70% of the city's surface area is dedicated to automobiles. The average person in the U.S. travels about 160 miles per week in a car. All right, some other problems are death of the central city. So currently, less than 10% of people work in the central city. There's less income to support public services. And higher infrastructure and energy costs. The extension of municipal services is more costly than supplying services to the areas already in the city, right? Like to run plumbing for water within the central city, that infrastructure is already there. But if we want to run city water out to homes in the country, that's going to be a lot of investment in infrastructure like pipes and plumbing, and work to install and maintain those to deliver city water, municipal services, to a much smaller number of people. So it's much more efficient to deliver those municipal services in a city. Loss of open space and farmland. Oftentimes, open space planning is left out of development plans. Flat, well-drained land is ideal for both farmland and urban development. And several states have established programs to provide protection to farmers who do not want to sell their land to developers. These programs may require farmers to put their land in a conservation easement. All right, you can take the time to study these images. Problems associated with unplanned growth. Air and water pollution. As traffic increases, so does air pollution. A centralized, efficient public transportation system solves this problem, but it's difficult to achieve with the highly dispersed population. Large, impervious surface areas lead to high runoff and potential flooding. It's also poorly energy efficient. Cars are inefficient transportation, right? Like most of us commute to work or school by ourselves. Separation of homes and businesses requires additional driving. Stop and go traffic patterns also reduce fuel efficiency, and single-family homes are less efficient than multifamily dwellings. Remember when we were talking about energy sources and we looked at graphs, most of the electricity that a home consumes or energy that a home consumes is in heating and cooling. But if you're in multifamily dwellings where you share walls, so you have fewer exterior walls on your home that actually touch the outside environment, those are better at retaining heat or keeping out heat in the summertime. All right, floodplain problems. Many cities are located on floodplains because they were originally established along the waterways. Flat land is attractive to developers, but would be better put to use as open space or for recreation. Development increases economic losses. Many communities have enacted floodplain zoning ordinances. All right, wetland misuse is another major problem associated with unplanned growth. So wetlands are areas that are periodically covered with water. Many have been drained, filled, or even used as landfills. The U.S. has lost more than half of its wetlands since European migration began, not including Alaska. And wetlands play a crucial role in the reproductive phase of many organisms. They also provide sediment filtration. These cattails, which are so common in Michigan, are actually really effective at pulling fertilizers and toxins and pollutants out of surface runoff water before it enters the water source. All right, so some important principles of land use planning. Land use planning is the process of evaluating the needs and wants of a population, the land characteristics and value, and various alternative solutions to land uses before changes are made. Many problems outlined in the previous sections can be avoided with proper land use planning, and a basic rule should be to make as few changes as possible. When changes are needed, we should evaluate and record unique geological, geographic, and biological features. Preserve unique cultural and historical features. Conserve open space and environmental features. And recognize and calculate the cost of additional changes required to accommodate altered land use. We should plan for mixed uses in close proximity, so you don't have to drive to run to the grocery store or to get to work or to get your kids to school. Plan for a variety of transportation options. Set limits and require managed growth patterns with compact development. And encourage development in areas with existing infrastructure. We should be investing in maintaining our central cities and making those desirable places to live for the people who live there. All right, mechanisms for implementing land use plans. Establish state and regional planning agencies. This pattern's more effective than local agencies because political boundaries seldom reflect the geological and biological database used in planning. A regional approach is more likely to prevent duplication of facilities and lead to greater efficiency. We should also consider restricting use. Zoning is a land use regulation that restricts the uses to which land in a region can be put. And often planners making zoning decisions represent business or other developing interests. All right, I'd like you to read through these examples on your own time. You don't need me to read them to you. All right, special urban planning issues. So urban transportation planning it usually involves 4 goals: conservation of energy and land resources, providing efficient and inexpensive transportation, particularly to those who are unable to drive, right? The more public transportation we offer that's actually utilized, the fewer cars we have on the road, and the more energy efficient our travel becomes. Providing efficient transportation opportunity to suburban residents, and reduce urban pollution. Transportation corridors and parking facilities must be included in any urban transportation plan. Mass transit in the U.S. is often underfunded and difficult to establish because it's only economical along heavily populated routes. It's less convenient than driving your own car, and it's extremely expensive to build and operate. And then when we do have public transportation in the U.S., it's often crowded and uncomfortable. The U.S. government encourages personal autos by financing highways, maintaining a cheap energy policy, and not funding mass transit projects. So take a moment to consider, if you could hop on a train or a bus 1 block from your home that would take you to campus, and it ran, say, every 20 minutes there was another bus going on that route. Would you take a bus to get here, or a train, some kind of public transportation other than your own personal vehicle? It might be tempting. All right, urban, open space, and recreation planning. So nearly 3/4 of North American population lives in urban areas. But until recently, urban parks were considered an uneconomical use of the land. And facilities not conveniently located near residential areas may be infrequently used, right? If you do live in an urban area, like in a central city, where you can walk to work and walk to the grocery store and walk to all the places you need to access, you might not need to invest in having your own car. But the cost of that would be that you can't afford, that you don't have a way to get out to, recreational areas and nature areas. New outgrowth of urbanization is the development of urban nature centers. And this, I believe, is a picture of the nature center in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's literally like just over here to the right is like skyscrapers and the big central city. And they have got this beautiful little nature center tucked, like nestled right up into the central city. It's a really beautiful, like a resource for everyone who lives there. And it's within walking distance from the central city, although I'm sure there's also public transportation routes to get there as well, like buses. So it can be done. We just have to plan for it, right? Which is what this is all about. Redevelopment of inner city areas. Special efforts must be made to revitalize the inner city. Abandoned industrial and commercial sites remain vacant because they're inexpensive to clean up and renovate. Brownfield development matches the degree of cleanup required to the intended use of the site. And another important focus is remodeling abandoned commercial buildings into shopping centers, cultural facilities, and high-density housing. And it can and has been done very well in some places. Smart growth recognizes the benefits of growth, and it advocates emphasizing developable, livable cities and towns. Smart growth recognizes that the quality of environment directly affects the quality of life. And a really cool local project, if you haven't heard of it before, is the Greening of Detroit. And this is an effort to beautify the city and increase food stability by turning abandoned areas into community gardens. So in the central city of Detroit, there's a lot of, like, there used to be a lot more people that lived there in the past than live there now. So there's buildings that are decaying and in disrepair and are just straight up dangerous, and no one wants to live in those places, right? Because they're not safe. But if we can remove those and use the space for community gardens, then we have provided natural areas for people to go and get away from city noise. There's a lot of mental health benefits to accessing natural areas and gardening. And also another problem that I haven't talked about yet is often in central cities, we have what are called food deserts. And a food desert is a place where, like, the population that lives there may not have access regularly to healthy foods. Things like fresh fruits and veggies and milk and bread. A lot of times in central cities, the population doesn't have their own cars because everything's within walking distance, right? But what if the only place you have to go buy food is a convenience store? Like if you had to live and feed your family off of just the food that a 7-Eleven carries, right? That's a food desert. They can't go buy apples and bananas and watermelons and green beans and onions and fresh ground beef and chicken and all those healthy basic ingredients that make up for a healthy, well-balanced diet. So the Greening of Detroit has been a really powerful success story for how we can use and repurpose spaces within central cities to the benefit of everyone in the population. So, all right. Some other smart growth principles are mixing land uses. So taking advantage of compact building designs. Create a range of housing opportunities and choices. So we could have like multifamily housing and single family housing together in the same area. Create walkable neighborhoods and foster distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. Preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas. Strengthen and direct development of existing areas. And provide a variety of transportation choices. Make fair, predictable, cost-effective development decisions. And encourage community and stakeholder collaborations in development decisions. So I'd like you to pause the video now and think about how these smart growth principles for urban planning are relevant to environmental justice. All right, one aspect of smart growth is the building of green buildings. Green buildings are built to a standard called Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED certified buildings. These guidelines call for using recycled materials, ensuring better ventilation in buildings, and reducing water and energy use, and other goals. Characteristics of a high-performance green building are low water flow fixtures installed on the faucets. The building's energy use is tested by an outside expert. Products don't contribute to ozone layer depletion. And occupants have outside views, including natural day lighting of work surfaces. Some federal government land use issues. So the U.S. government owns and manages about 30% of the land in our country. Several U.S. agencies, including the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, allocate and regulate the lands that they control. However, these agencies sometimes have conflicting roles. Designation of certain lands as wilderness is a sensitive issue. And the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 divided the use of our natural forests into 4 categories: wildlife habitat preservation, recreation, lumbering, and watershed protection. Many people want to use the natural world for recreational purposes because nature can provide challenges lacking in our everyday lives. Conflicts develop because some activities can't occur in the same place at the same time. And groups argue that because they pay taxes, they have a right to use that public land as they wish. All right, so in summary, waterways have served as transportation corridors that allowed for the exploration of new land and the transportation of goods. Urban centers began as small towns located near water for this reason. Several factors resulted in a shift of the population from rural to urban areas. Unregulated industrial development in cities led to the degradation of waterfronts and stimulated the development of suburbs. However, many problems have resulted from unplanned growth. Land use planning involves gathering data, projecting needs, and developing mechanisms for implementing the plan. Establishing regional planning agencies, purchasing land and its development rights, and enacting zoning ordinances are ways to implement land use planning. Federal governments own and manage large amounts of land, so national policy must be developed. And often, federal policy is a compromise between competing uses, and land is managed for multiple uses. All right, so that wraps up the lecture for Chapter 12. If you have any questions, please bring them to office hours or class with you. All right.